Hello, everyone. Welcome to Thursday again. We seem to have settled on Thursday. It's a bit weird. We used to do these on all different days, on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays and strangely Thursdays. But we seem to have settled on Thursday as the weekly gang. So welcome everyone that's here every week. For those of you that aren't normally here, I'll run through some of the starting stuff before we get going. So first of all, hello. Second of all, just remember a couple of things with streaming. So there is a little bit of a delay between your comments getting through to me so that we can talk and we can have some of the question and answer stuff. So bear in mind when you put something into the screen, takes it about 10 or 15 seconds for it to pop up at my end, and it's simply because I'm actually broadcasting about 15 seconds ahead of when you see it. They say live, it's not really, because of some of the platforms we use. So I'm not ignoring you, but please do, as we go, put your comments on. If you've got any questions as we're going, or I edit something and it doesn't make sense, or you've got a better idea, which happens, which is cool, then by all means put them into the comments. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can, and we'll edit as we go, expecting hopefully that we get some of you joining in. Right, so to get started then, let's have a look at our version. So we are editing today on Capture One, version 20 or version 13, depending on whether you trust the marketing guys or the software guys to give you the current version. Basically, it's the same thing. Version 13 is version 20, but 20 was the year 2020, so it made sense from a marketing point of view. However, the most important thing is that you're running version 20.1.2, or as it will come up in your software, 13.1.2. So a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the 0.1 bit was the bit that introduced the new cloning tools, healing tools, before and after tools, and a much better set of editing functions that we didn't have before. The 0.2 bit is the 2 bug fix releases that they've shipped since then, so service releases. So relatively small changes, but they fixed some critical stuff that was getting in the way when 13.1 or 20.1 first came out. So please make sure you're on the latest version if you're using Capture One. If you're not using Capture One, you can download it for free from capture1.com. There's a free trial for 30 days. You can give it a go, play along with some of the stuff that we're doing here. By all means, have a look from a pricing point of view. They've got lots of discounts on at the moment, especially if you're going to buy the license outright. But there's also the subscription one. We covered this last time, but I've had a couple of questions since. So, general rule, in my head, may not be the correct answer, but in my head, if you want to own your software and be in control of cost, but at the risk and sacrifice of not necessarily being up to date all the time, you don't ever really own software, so there is that caveat. But if you want your piece of software and you want to know that you've got it for as long as your operating system or computer can support it, buy the license, no problem. You don't have to pay anyone any more money in the future, and it's your license to use for as long as you can. If, however, being on the most recent, always up-to-date, most current version of Capture One is the most important thing to you, then switch to a subscription model. That's what it's there for. If you're always going to upgrade every single year, then it doesn't make sense to keep with the upgrade costs, because actually if you look at the subscription cost, quite often it's lower over the year, and you're always going to have the latest version. So if you're not worried about the latest version, by all means go buy, and at the moment there are some great discounts on the current version. If you are worried about always being up to date, then look at the subscription model. It's not companies holding you to ransom. I always used to laugh when, don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of the Adobe, the way that they did it, in terms of you had no option for perpetual license. But look at how many people used to steal Photoshop. So they've gone from a company that used to have like 90% of people using illegal copies to finally a company that actually that can actually invest in improving their software. Whether they have invested in improving the software is a different thing. However, there we go. So 2 different license versions, but either way, make sure you're up to date on the latest version of Capture One if you can. Okay, so hello everyone who is in here. Well, we've got Spain, Illinois, Germany, Norway, Austria, Florida. Guessing Japan or Korea. I'm not that great on the on those characters, I'm afraid. But hi Hans, hi Raymond, hi Kevin. So some of the usual gang and some new ones. Right, let's get into Capture One. So this is our Capture One interface. Most of you will be familiar with this. It's effectively a library that we've got here. So we've got, in my case, I'm using a catalog. Again, very briefly, if you're doing a specific job in a specific period of time, sessions are a great way to manage your work. If, like me, you do, let's say, a shoot over a week or 2 weeks or so on, and you want ways of moving certain images around into different folders and so on without the file system being affected, so sessions are tied to your file system, Catalogs gives you that layer over the top where you can potentially change things like moving collections around without moving where the physical file is. It also has, for me, some better filtering, some better ways of organizing stuff in general. So I tend to use catalogs. Sessions work in the same way when it comes to editing. It's just that in terms of organization, they're tied to the file system rather than this arbitrary database over the top. So this is our first image we're going to have a look at. It's from Earl. I said we'd start with this one this week. So really cool watery shot. It's at, so there's a couple of things. So it's at 20 seconds. So we've got the nice smooth sort of milky water. It's at f/22. So ideally we'd want a slightly wider aperture than that, just for sharpness. However, if we look at the choices you've got to make, and if we forget the editing bit and we just put our photo hat on for a second, I always have a problem with photographers that will say, this was shot wrong. This was technically wrong. It should have been shot with this and this and this. You weren't there at the time. You don't know the constraints that someone was under. And actually, more importantly, I would rather get a shot that is usable and is workable and printable and whatever than not. I've seen people fiddle around for 15 minutes in some cases, trying different aperture combinations and whatever to try and keep their aperture at f8 and all these different filter combinations and whatever. If they'd shot it at f16, they would have got the shot. If they didn't, they missed the opportunity. The sunset went, gone. So get the shot is the first thing. Worry about the technical stuff for sure, but getting the shot not technically perfect is better than not getting the shot at all. So this is at f/22. What that has given us is a little bit of softness, I'm sure. We'll have a look in a second. But it's also given us a huge depth of field. So we've got everything from this leaf here all the way back to these trees, nicely in focus. So even though we might have a little bit of, maybe a little bit of diffraction out here, we've got a great depth of field across the whole image. And we've got these leaves lovely and sharp. Look at that water on that one there as well. So we can play with this, we can edit it, and actually we can fix some of those softness issues right up in a couple of clicks. So what f/22 is giving us, and we can see it here, look, I mean, we're being unfair, we're at 200%, that's at 100%, but we are getting some elements that suggest it's a little bit soft at this at that aperture. So let's go to our lens correction tab. Up here, it's a generic lens profile it's brought in. We can find out, if I go to the information tab up here, what it was shot with. So it's a D800, but the lens information is just a random 20mm f2.8. I'm not sure whether that's actually the lens or not. But effectively, this isn't a lens that Capture One has recognized. It's pulled in a serial number, but it doesn't know what the lens is. So rather than trying to find some random, whether it's a Nikon lens or whatever, do not just go and grab a random 20mm lens or something like that. Every lens has different characters, different properties. So when Capture One applies these lens profiles, it's literally using a recipe based on that exact lens and how it behaves in different light. So don't be tempted to just grab a similar lens. I think a couple of sessions ago there was one lens, I can't remember which one it was, but one of you guys pointed it out very very helpfully, thank you. Basically there's two versions of this lens that's made, one for sports and one that's not. It's in theory the same optical design, but there are a couple of little features on one of them that aren't on the other. So in that case, and if I did a bit of testing, then I'd be comfortable picking the other one. However, the challenge that you're going to get is if there is any optical difference between those two models, the corrections that Capture One does are either not going to be effective, or in a worst case scenario, they're going to have a negative effect. So if your lens hasn't been picked up by Capture One and you cannot find the exact lens that's in, Look to see if Capture One has brought in something called Manufacturer Profile. Manufacturer Profile means that it's reading in data from the camera about that lens, which is great. And if it's not got that, then stick with generic. There's no way at the moment that you can upload your own profile, so generic is the best way to go. Now, with chromatic aberration on a generic lens, it doesn't know what to do with this lens. So what will happen is it'll force this thing called analyze. So I always tell people to do this anyway, even when you do have the right lens loaded. But on a generic profile, it's always going to force you to analyze because it doesn't know what to do to fix the chromatic aberration. It has to have a look across the image. We can tick this diffraction correction little box, and it's going to try and sharpen this stuff up. But again, it doesn't know the lens that we're using, so it's got to be a bit careful so it doesn't screw anything up. But more importantly, you're not going to get a great result in terms of fixing this sharpness fall off here. Luckily, though, we've got this lovely little sharpness fall off slider, so it unfortunately gets cut here in terms of the wording, and for some reason it never really it never moves across. But if you use this slider, imagine it's like a vignette but for sharpness. So what we don't want to do is load up here the middle. Okay, we do not want to load up all of the sharpening in the center of this frame, because actually the center is looking pretty good. Sorry guys, I've just seen a note. Pablo's just saying the default live is not working. I clicked the 1440 version and it does. So we broadcast at 1440p, so HD version. But he's saying it's playing the 27th of August. So it's really difficult to do this. So if you aren't watching, how do I do this? If you're not watching us live, let us know, but you don't know to do that. So let's have a little look. For some reason, the feed isn't working on YouTube. But let's have a little look. Let me see if I can do that and multitask at the same time. So back to sharpness fall off. The sharpness fall off tool is effectively going to sharpen the outside of the lens as if it was a sharpening mask vignette, which is different to the sharpening tool, which either needs us to mask it or it needs us to effectively erase some of the stuff in the middle if I wanted to just affect the outside. So guys, on the feed, I'm getting weird things where some people are saying it's fine, some people are saying it's not. We've got a load of people watching live on YouTube, so it's a little bit weird. But they're watching live on a weird date. Sorry about that, guys. That's a bit strange. So I'm not sure what's going on. I'm really sorry. I can't really help from here. However, hopefully, if I do something in a second, I'm just going to delete something there. And hopefully that then fixes the date. There we go. So now it should say 3rd of September in YouTube, I hope. So, bit of an explain. We tried something very clever today, which was to pre-build the event in Facebook and on YouTube, because the streaming software we use, Restream, apparently can do that automatically. Evidently it can't, so sorry about that. It's now the correct date, but for some reason it's a little bit weird in the way that it's done it. Sorry, but hopefully it's all a bit better. Right, back to Capture One, more importantly. So, a sharpness fall off is not going to affect the sharpness in the middle of the frame. It's going to affect the sharpness around the edges. So if I pull this all the way up, let's go up to 250, way up, and we look in the middle of the frame, whether I have this on or off, it's having no effect whatsoever. Let's just move it on, nothing. However, if I go out to the corners of the frame, and let's just go really in, so we're at 200% so you can see, now put sharpness fall off on, you see how sharp that's got compared to without. So the sharpness fall off is a great tool where if you've got a lens in particular, but if you've got a shot as well in general, that has that sort of softness as it goes out to the widest parts of the lens, especially on wide angle lenses, what you can find is it can fix right up using that tool. So be careful that you don't overdo it. We don't want to end up either with any artifacts that we don't want, or we don't want any weirdness in terms of that fall. If you do it too much, what you can find is there becomes a little border between where it's been sharpened and where it's left the image alone. But as long as you don't see any of that, you can push this a reasonable way up, and that's actually giving us a really good recovery on the edges of this image, which previously were a little bit soft because potentially we were using that really small aperture of f22. Light fall off does the same thing, but effectively light fall off is a reverse vignette. If I do it maximum, you can see. Sharpness fall off is going to help you in these cases here. At 20mm, there may be some distortion, but actually, look what's happening to those trees out there. To be honest, with a landscape like this, as long as your trees aren't doing anything crazy and bowing or something like that, I would leave it without the distortion correction, because any distortion correction, remember, you're going to lose some of your image. If I turn the crop tool on so you can see, so the crop tool's up here, and I move the distortion tool up here, in theory, what Capture One thinks it's done is straighten that image up. In practice, in this case, what it's done is also delete a load of the content out of our crop, because to make the image fixed, it's now pulled those corners and made some changes. Bit weird. Okay, so we're going to leave distortion correction where it was, and we're going to move on to the exposure. So the good news, from what I've seen from loads of you on the comments, is some of you have now got back onto the YouTube thing and it's all okay. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. I don't know why it did it with the wrong the wrong reminder and the wrong date, but for some reason it did. Really sorry. The good news is it's all recorded, so you can watch it later, the first 15 minutes, but it was mostly me either chatting away about versions and licenses, or it was me looking at comments and getting worried that none of you could see anything that was going on. So on to our exposure tab. So the most used tab in Capture One for me tends to be this one. It looks like a histogram. It's the exposure tab, and it's got most of the tools that we're going to use. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is look at our curve. Because this was shot on a Fuji, and I know we cover this quite a bit, but I do need to make sure that people are aware of this. Because it was shot with a Fuji, it means that the Fuji camera, especially with the more recent cameras and with the Capture One version since the Fuji partnership was announced, now incorporate the film curve that you set in your RAW file. So what that means is whatever settings you put on the camera in terms of the film curve or the film effect that you wanted to apply will automatically apply when you bring it into Capture One. So Capture One's going to use that first before it goes to its normal, which would be auto. So for any other camera, pretty much, some of the Nikon ones do it a little bit as well. But for most of the cameras, when you bring something into Capture One, it's going to have a curve of auto, which is Capture One doing what it thinks is best, and it's going to pull. Oh, sorry, actually, oh, you're right. Yeah, it's a Nikon curve in this case, so it's a perfect example. So the Fuji one actually has a huge number of curves that it brings in. The Nikon one's only got one or two, but it's going to bring that curve in and apply what you had in the camera and what you had set in the camera. For most other cameras, it's going to go to auto. Auto takes the curve, that sort of line, that diagonal line that says the value of 10 is 10, the value of 20 is 20, the value of 30 is 30, and so on. It goes into the RGB channels, and it changes that curve to give you, frankly, somewhat more of contrast and punch and pop and all the stuff that we want to try and get normally in a picture. However, it can also result in our highlights being blown out or our shadows being underexposed. So if I go up here, and let's just have a look. This I've just switched to a linear response curve. If I go back to auto, we can see how much brighter and vivid it is, but it's also significantly overexposed. So if I turn my exposure warning on, this little handy button up here, so on linear response we've got this, on auto we've got significantly more. We just switch that on there, so linear response, auto curve. The same with the Nikon curve that it loaded in, so the film standard 2, more overexposed, linear response, less overexposed. Now, the challenge with this, and we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, is linear response has the effect of flattening the image. You can see that. It's lost all of that punch, all of that excitement and stuff in there. So here is our image on auto. I'm going to remove the film standard V2 out of the equation. So this is our default for Capture One, which is auto. And here is our curve on linear response. So yes, we've got more detail in the highlights. Yes, we've probably got more detail in the shadows as well, but it's lost that pop. So we have to have two different versions in our head of how we're going to attack this. I can either set my starting point to be linear response. What that does is it flattens my histogram, it flattens my curve, everything becomes a bit more muted. So I don't have punchy highlights, I don't have dark shadows, and I have almost literally the raw readout from the camera. That's the idea of linear response. From there, I've got to build in some contrast if I want it. Or I can start from auto. And if I start from auto, I've now got to recover some of that stuff that it's punched. So it's punched up the highlights and it's punched down the shadows. From there, I've effectively got to do either some HDR working or some exposure working to bring back the detail that it may have overexposed or underexposed in the highlights and shadows. So this comes down to how you believe this picture needs to end up. If you believe it needs to end up quite poppy and there's only a couple of little overexposure things to fix, we'd start from the auto curve and bring things as we need to down. If, however, I want it to be a bit softer as a feel, or I've got a lot of things that are overexposed or crushed in the shadows, I might want to start from linear response and then bring in some contrast where I want. Okay, so let's start with our auto curve in this case. And up here we can see that we've got some overexposure. The exposure warning in Capture One, just one thing as well to bear in mind with it. It is not telling you whether the raw is overexposed. It is from the start because we haven't made any changes. But that exposure warning is going to tell us if any pixel has a value of higher than 255 in either the red, green, blue channels or a combination. If I pull down the exposure on my slider here, all of a sudden that warning has disappeared. And the reason is because these values now are no longer 255. There's 237, 239, 241. I'm just reading these numbers up here as I move my mouse around. But you've got to be very careful because even on an image which is completely overexposed, so let me just show you something. I'm going to switch to a shot by Claudio quickly. So here is an image with a light flare. It's the star flare or starburst from a street light. And obviously it's overexposed. It's shot at night and we're shooting directly into the light, so it is overexposed. It's 255, 255, 255 at the top. Let's go to our exposure tab. Let's turn on our warning. And let's pull down the exposure. Great, no warning. The reason is because look at our numbers, 179, 179, 179. So I fixed it, right? I've got all the detail back, yeah? No. What Capture One is telling you is those pixels are now no longer overexposed in your edit. It is not telling you that that area was not overexposed. So there comes a point where even if I pull down the exposure right the way down, it makes no difference. My exposure warning will disappear, but I'm not getting any more detail. So be really careful with these warnings. They're not necessarily telling you that the problem has gone away. If you're having to pull down one of these sections more than about 2 stops, chances are all Capture One is doing is making the whites grey. It's not actually introducing any detail or anything like that in there. It's just darkening the pixels. So Vadim's just asked, set clipping warning values and preferences. Yes. So if we go into our preferences in Capture One, you will see under exposure that you've got the warning threshold. So you can change, for a start, you can change some of the colors that you want. You can also have a shadow warning on there as well. A lot of people, because so the defaults are actually quite conservative, a lot of people will put this actually at either 254 or 255. The reason is because when something is 250 or 251, it's not overexposed. You haven't lost anything. So maybe pushing it right up, so to say, only warn me that this is overexposed when it's above 254. That's perfectly okay. Okay, so let's just turn our exposure warning off and on again so we can see there's still a couple of little bits in there. If I pulled it down a bit more, then great. Okay, but here's the problem. Once we've done that, we've also turned off the lights on everything else in the shot. That's not great either, right? So we've started off with this auto curve that we know is going to be quite contrasty. It's going to have some overdone highlights. It's going to have some underdone shadows as a result of the curve that Capture One has put in. And we've pulled down exposure and we know that we can get all this detail back of these branches and leaves. So if I just temporarily undo, so to temporarily do it, we hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the keyboard and click the little undo button here. It's different to the before and after tool because this is just on the exposure tool on its own. So I can see there's more detail in here. Great. But I've lost all the detail and all the color and all the vibrance down at the bottom. So instead of using the exposure tool, what I can do is use our HDR tool. And if I look at the HDR tool, I've got 2 different things that can help me here. One is highlights, one is whites. So highlights covers the top end of our histogram. let's say the top quarter, maybe a bit less than that, maybe a bit more, but it's around the top sort of 20 or 20%, 25%. White is the top bit of those highlights. So imagine it's the top sort of 5% of the histogram values. The reason that's important is that highlights also includes the whites. White does not include all of the highlights. Same with the other end of the histogram. So in shadows, let's say it's the bottom quarter of the histogram values. The shadows area actually includes the blacks area, which is, let's say, the bottom 5%. The blacks area does not necessarily affect shadows. So on this one, as I move my mouse around, use this orange bar on your histogram on the left to really help you see where something is on our histogram. When it goes off the end, so clipped, you actually see the orange bar disappears off to the right. But we can see here, these leaves are in the sort of mid-tones. You can see the orange bar moving around the middle. Up here, it's well into the highlights and probably into the whites. And this area here that we're trying to affect in isolation is purely in that whites area. So if I just pull that white slider down, it's having some effect on it. But remember, highlights also includes the whites. So if I want to make sure I've got all of this detail up here, and I know that I'm not affecting anything else because nothing else in the image is in the highlights, it's only this sky area. Let's pull down our highlights. In fact, we could go massive. We can go a -100. We'd never normally do it to that level. But what I'm doing is effectively bringing back the detail here. So let's go before and after. So before, after. So I've got back some of the finer details in the leaves and the twigs and so on without affecting any of the rest of the image, unlike exposure would have done. So Earl's just said, now we're almost at linear response. Not quite. So the challenges with linear response is not only would it have affected the highlights, it also would have flattened out the shadows. And it's shadows I kind of want to keep in this because we've got these lovely dark areas in here. If the way that we'd almost get to linear response is we almost start to get into an HDR world here, but with less contrast. So in the linear response curve, we'd see a lot more of this shadow here. I don't want to really in this shot. I like the fact that you've got some darkness and some depth in it. So that's why in my head, I would start with this shot from auto and correct the highlights because I know I can get enough of that back. If I think that's going to be too much of a challenge, if my histogram is way too spread out, so too many bright highlights, too many dark shadows, start at linear response and add the contrast in when you need it. Okay, Brian's made it from Wyoming. Brian, sorry if you were on the other YouTube link for some reason. I screwed up, I think, and it all sort of went a little bit wrong. So welcome. So in terms of what we then do with this image, well, the fun thing with this stuff is we can play with our white balance now. So on this image, this is as shot, it's out of the camera, so no problem there. We can warm it up. So we can move this, so obviously Kelvin goes from cold light to warm light, so we can effectively warm up the feel of this image. We can make it a little bit more autumnal, that's a cool word. And I can bring up a little bit of tint. And we can go from green effectively into magenta. Now remember, the tint originally was there to fix color cast on filters. What we're finding now more and more is people are also using tint as an artistic approach to changing some of the feel of an image. So typically, as you get colder, sometimes you'll find that the tint of the image becomes a bit greener. So what we want to do is we will need to move the tint back up to keep it nice and neutral. But what I'm looking for is, of course, I could have clicked in here. So let's just go in here and say, well, I think this water here should be white. So let's click it. Great. And I'm back to pretty much daytime. That's actually not far off what was shot. That looks pretty good. So the picker tool here has done a good job. But this now comes down to how you interpret it. So if you interpret this image to feel like it should be a bit warmer, like I would, well, we can just warm it up, not by too much. Don't push this too far. But that just feels so much more inviting as an image in my head than what it did with the cold, probably correct white balance. But then this is where the difference is between what we produce based on what we remember versus the technical balance of exactly what Kelvin that shot was taken with. We do have a problem on this shot. Clean your filter or your lens. We got a water drop. Honestly, I've shot in these lakes before. All it takes is one little splash and you're going to get that thing. honestly, on this, yes, we could try and do this with the healing tool in Capture One. It's not going to do a great job. And I'm allowed to say that, but there we go. Let's so it's got to guess where it wants to take the origin from. It's going to guess wrong. It's got that rock down there. Let's just have a little look over here at what it's going to do if I tell it the origin out here. Where are we? It's got to build a new tree, basically. This is the stuff, honestly, that pixel editors are just better at doing. So, of course, we can leave it like this. It's going to look okay. The fact that it's out in the distance probably wouldn't be noticed by too many people, but it is incorrect. So, for this sort of stuff, just bear in mind, a raw editor is designed to go so far. For global adjustments and maybe some little local changes and stuff like that, the raw editor is the best place you can do it with the least damage to your photo. When it comes to specific fixes at pixel level, there are better tools out there than any of the raw editors for doing this stuff. So look at the Photoshop options, look at the affinity options and whatever else. We can do something that sort of fixes it here with the blending of the heal tool, but it's not going to quite get it right. Okay. Now, when I change, so by the way, the heal layer, when I did that, of course, it's created a new layer on the left-hand side. So be careful that I'm now editing that layer. I don't want to do that. I want to go back to my background, which is where I was, and now make those adjustments on the background layer, not on the heal layer. So background selected. Of course, we had this area here, which when I changed the white balance has made that waterfall color a little bit more muddy, a little bit more murky, and I'm not too happy with that. So let's create a new layer, and it's going to create a new what's called adjustment layer, and I'm going to call it waterfall. And I'm going to grab my brush tool. So brush up here. I've got a thick brush set at the moment, so I can either right click with the mouse or I can go to my brush settings over here. And we're going to make it a little bit smaller, really soft edge, 100% flow, pull down my opacity. Difference of opinion always on whether or not you should use opacity or flow to control the brush. I use opacity, David uses flow. It depends on how you've come at this and from where you came and all that sort of stuff. But to me, I always find the opacity to be a little more forgiving. Itchy nose again. Okay, so all I'm doing is painting over my white area here of the waterfall. And into here. Okay, so my mask, to turn it on, M, to turn it off, M again. I can also see my mask in grayscale, so remember, you don't have to only see it in the red over the top. So if I go to display grayscale mask on the settings over here, I can see what I've painted. So with my mask painted, I've now got two options. One is I can further refine it and say I want to pick on the luma range of none of the dark stuff. There we go. Only the white stuff, and we'll have a nice soft edge on it. We'll have a nice soft radius so it blends. So this luma range basically tells Capture One to only select this part of the histogram that I've basically drawn from 0 to 255. The top bars are the key select areas. The bottom bars tell Capture One how much of a feather or how much of a fall off you want from what's selected and what's not. So the longer that ramp, the more soft the fall off is, but the more areas that aren't included in your main area are also going to be included in the mask. So by setting that, I can now refine the mask and only affect the areas that are bright in the image. And that's what a luma range does. I don't have to do that. I could have left it as it was, but in this case, I'm going to leave it on just so we can have a look. Now, with that lot selected, I can now go into my exposure and I can pull it up. I can also change my white balance a little bit just on the water. So I can cool this bit down. And also, you see this yellowy color up here? Well, if I really wanted to, I can go to my color editor now. Let's go to advanced, just for fun. Click on my little picker tool and click this color up here. And it's selected this sort of arc of the yellow. I'm going to just expand it so we cover a bit more of that. And with that arc, I'm going to pull down the saturation and pull up the lightness. So you see what we did? We drew a mask over the area we wanted to affect. We then refined that mask using the luma range that said, even though Paul's drawn roughly where he wanted, actually I only want to affect these areas of the histogram, so the bright bits, the white parts of the water. So I use the luma range to select that area, but keep it nice and soft, keep it falling off, so feathering towards the edge so you don't notice that there's a line around it. If I didn't have that fall off, you'd see a sharp edge around there. Let me just turn the mask on. So you see this sharp line here? You're going to notice that when you print it. So we want to do this so it falls away softly and you can see the difference. Then, so not only have I drawn only over the water, I've now said only the bright parts of the bit that I drew. And then I've said, and actually on the yellow bits of the bright parts of the bit I drew, now reduce the saturation and increase the lightness. And the difference is if I turn this layer off, so the waterfall layer, there's our before, there's our after. Look how murky the before looked compared to now. Now you've got to be careful because we want to make sure that this is as true to reality as possible. But to me, some element of this, so of course we've got our opacity on our layer on the top left as well. So we can change, we can say none of that effect or all of that effect or anywhere in between. So I can effectively dial it into the max. So I can say white, 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 no color in it whatsoever. Let's keep it crisp, cold, pure white water with nothing else in it. And then dial it back. And I can dial it back to the point that it is natural and real, rather than this sort of. I see it a lot of people with teeth, on models' teeth. Quite often they overdo the whitening. Let's say that's probably a bit kind. Okay, so a couple of questions as we're going through. So for Kev, can we show at some point how we jump over to Photoshop and fix the water drop and then come back to capture one? We can. Let me see if I can do that in a second. Yeah, Luma Range is a great tool. Yes. So Pablo, I just discovered with the color tab I can create a mask from that color selection. Yes, that was what we covered that last week. So yes, if I wanted to select the fold on its own, of course I could create a mask and a selection, but actually I don't really need to, having done what we've just done, because all I wanted was that area to be affected, and I made the effect directly onto the layer. If I wanted to reuse that as a mask, all I've got to do with my color selection, click on these three dots and go to create mask layer from selection. That gives me a mask based on, but remember in this case, that would only be the yellow parts of that waterfall, not the white parts, because the white parts were what I used the Luma Range for. The yellow parts I just used to pull down the saturation on that yellow color to get that top part looking a bit more clear. Yeah, deep except for whitening the water. Works in anything. So it does work on teeth, it works on eyes, it works on water and whatever else. And yes, so you can mix that selection with the Luma and refine with the eraser too. Yes, so you can erase bits. Even if the Luma Range doesn't get it quite right, you can still refine your original selection. Remember, the Luma Range sits on top of whatever you've drawn. So it's a selection of your selection. If you change your selection, the Luma Range will react to that too. So back to Kev's point, could we show at some point how we go into Photoshop? So round trip, right click on the image and just come over here so you can see it a bit more. And I'm going to go to edit with, and I choose Photoshop from my list. I choose the export settings for this image. So in this case, I'm going to go to Adobe RGB as a 16-bit TIFF, go to edit variants, and my machine is going to prepare that image, and it's going to load up Photoshop, which I wasn't planning on doing. So let's just load up our Photoshop window, which is going to be huge on your screen. So let me just make it fit so we can see. So let's go on to here. Let's just get rid of all of this stuff over the right hand side. Right, so let's go and find our tree, our little rogue tree. So we've got a couple of branches that aren't quite right there, and so on. Well, we could actually, and in fact, just to prove the point, let's just try something. On here, I'm going to turn off my healing layer. So you remember the water droplet? It was on a separate layer, the heal layer. So that's with my quick capture one heal. That's without. If I turn off the heal layer, and I'm going to go to edit with Photoshop again, and I'm going to go to edit this variant. Even though I'm already editing another one in Photoshop, it creates the same file name, but with a 1 on the end of it. So now in Photoshop, I've got these two documents. One is the one with Capture One's fix, and one is the one without Capture One's fix. So let's try without first. Quick Lasso tool in Photoshop. Let's see what it does. So all of this stuff here, and we can do a fill, and we can say content aware, and see what Photoshop comes up with. Awful, really bad. Okay, so content aware isn't that aware, and it's not able to do a very good job with this. So let's have a little look at our version. So this is with an instant heal in Capture One, and we're going to try and refine it in Photoshop. So yeah, Pablo, to your point, we could do the one without the drop to make locating the spot easier. We could, but it didn't work very well in Photoshop. So this is interesting actually. We've used a bit of healing in Capture One, but it didn't do quite such a great job. But actually, it's left me with very small things to do. So what I can do, let's just use our little healing patch tool. So if I pick on this area here and go find another part of this branch, how is it going to merge that? Pretty badly, because we're going from two different light levels. That's not great either. So instead, I'm probably going to just use our clone tool. So stamp tool up here on the left, I'm going to set it to 100%, and we're going to go and find little bits of foliage, and we're going to become a little bit like a painter, and we're going to paint in a way that hopefully most people don't notice. So we've got a little bit of a weird thing here with one branch coming down here and not matching the base of it there. So we'll just take a little bit of that. That looks pretty good. This bit here is a little bit wrong. So we'll take maybe a little bit of this with the light in it. That looks pretty good. And let's take a bit of this branch here. That's looking quite nice. And then we've got this weird branch here that sort of ends in the middle of nowhere. So what we'll do is we'll probably get rid of it, I guess. Can't remember what was in the original. We can't quite see what's behind it, so we've got to do a bit of invention. But there should be a branch that comes across here, which is a bit of a problem because we've got this sort of twig sticking out from nowhere. I'm not sure we can do much in the way of building that branch back, but let's take a little bit of that across there. Let's go into there. Oh, no, that's a bit too close, but you can see what we're doing. I'm not going to complete this in Photoshop because you're going to get very bored just watching me take pixels and paint them over the top. But with a bit of time spent, and what we do is we switch our blend mode to darken, so maybe we could pick up the branch on its own without necessarily picking up everything else around it. I'm not sure what we do here. We might have to take another bit of a branch from somewhere else to build that arm, or what we could do actually is remove the remnants of the rest of it so that we don't notice that it was actually going over the string. So let's have a look at that. Okay, right. For the purposes of this, that's sort of enough. But here's the important bit. When I save this, so I'm just going to make a point so you can see the key difference here. I'm just going to go onto my brush tool and create a nice red. In fact, I won't use red because that will confuse things because it's the color of a mask in Capture One. I'm going to create a big blue blob, okay, for no reason whatsoever. And I'm going to hit the save button in Photoshop. I can close this image now. I can close this image too. So don't save that one. Let's go into Capture One. So Capture One now has my TIFF, which is my edited version from Photoshop. So I've now got the raw with my edits. Let's just go in to see both of these at the same time so we can see them together. So I've got my raw with the original here. Let's just turn on our healing layer again. So that was what Capture One did. That's what Photoshop did, which is a little more blended, a little better, but we really want to spend a bit more time with it. However, look at the difference now on these tools. So on my raw, my background layer, I've still got all the changes I made. I've got my HDR changes, I've got my colored balance and so on. In the TIFF, that's all reset to zeros. So remember, when you do the round tripping, we call it round tripping, but basically from Photoshop or from Affinity back into Capture One, what you're bringing back is not a raw. What you're bringing back is a flattened pixel-based file. That can be a problem when you really, really want to make some changes later on. So although it's called round tripping, and the idea is wonderful, you can go into Photoshop and you can come back again, in and back and so on. Try and do the pixel edits last, because you're going to be limited in what you can do with the other bits of your image if you do it too early on. So get your image looking right. Leave it to the point where only the very last bits need to be changed in a pixel editor. Then go into whatever you choose as a program to do that. And then and only then save it back as a TIFF, because the second it becomes a TIFF and it's flattened, unfortunately, there's not much more you can do with that file. Okay, so let's go back to our raw. Kev, I hope that sort of answered it in terms of going to fix and whatever. it's genuinely a case of we just need to spend too much time doing that to show it on here. But from that point of view and from the images point of view, we're looking pretty good. I would be tempted potentially to just pull the focus up here a little bit into the middle. So normally we don't do radial masks, but in this case I'm going to. Whoops, I've just undone my mask. Interesting point. Last week we did something where I tried to put two gradients. I was trying to be clever. I rasterized one and then put the other one on there. It's not a case that it's not about the fact that you cannot have more than one gradient on a layer. That is true as a statement, but the reason is not about the number of gradients. Whenever you paint a gradient layer or a gradient onto a layer in Capture One, it removes any other mask from that layer. So be really careful. So for instance, here, I've got a mask on my waterfall. Even though I don't have another gradient, because the limitation that we always see is that you can't have more than one gradient. It's not that. The second I draw a gradient, it has removed the original mask. Regardless of how I've done the original mask, it makes no odds. You can only have the gradient layer on a layer the second you start drawing. It will remove anything else. So we're going to create a new layer. And I'm going to call this radial. And with our radial layer here, I'm going to draw a really soft. So to make it soft, we pull this into the middle. So we've got our really wide line out here. Really soft radius, really soft gradient going in, and with that we are going to pull our exposure down a little bit. So we pull the focus into, funnily enough, these leaves. So what I don't need to do is that looks wrong. It looks unnatural. So even though we want that to be our focus, the way that we do it is by pulling the focus into the middle so that the darkness around this edge here brings you to those leaves. If I really wanted those leaves to pop a little bit more, let's create a new layer, leaves. And we're going to go into our brush tool, and I'm just going to paint very, very rapidly over these leaves, just enough so that I can show you what happens then with those leaves when I dial in a little bit of clarity. And that's all. So let's go to 100%. So again, this is without, and that's with. Entirely down to your choice in terms of whether we do that final step, but to me that just gives it a little bit more pop. And let's go to before and after. So here's our before. Nothing wrong with that shot. Really nice shot. Nice shot. Oh, well done. But there's our after that just feels a bit warmer, a bit softer, a bit more inviting. Okay, so that's 47 minutes. We've only edited one photo. That's got to be a record. But one thing I did want to come on to is this shot here. Claudio will come back to you probably next week or next sessions. One, because I do want to have a play with this shot that you did in the town. But David sent this one in. So this is it's a press shot, effectively. Now, when it comes to editing, pretty much everything I've just done on this shot here, we're limited when this is photojournalism. I can't change the color of the water. I can't remove a branch. I can't change stuff like that. I can do a bit of clarity stuff. I can do a little bit of white balance adjustment, but I'm very, very limited in terms of what I can do, because for journalistic images, it has to be a true representation of what was there. So here's our, I think you mentioned it was under 18 or Major League under 18s thing. Either way, if they're under 18, I ain't getting involved in that stuff, because that just looks brutal even at that age. And having been to one of these things, I remember we were sat near the glass screens, and wow, those guys hit those things hard. Okay, so let's go into, so first off, let's just have a look on our info tag, what was used. So it was 1DX. We have an EF 300 lens. So I'm hoping when I go into the lens profile, it didn't load it in. I wonder why not. Is it because maybe it's an older version of the lens, 300mm, 2.8, or maybe, just maybe, Capture One just haven't got it profiled. No, they do, but they only have the version 2. So again, on my own advice, with experimentation, if you're willing to put in the time and actually look at your lens and take some test shots and do it with the correction and without the correction, and the version 2 works okay for all of those corrections, then great. But if not, stick with generic. Turn on your chromatic aberration, get it to analyze. It's going to do some work, and it's going to get it a bit cleaner. We don't have any diffraction issues. We shouldn't do at f4 on that particular lens there. Distortion at 300mm, there's going to be hardly any. In fact, even if I did it, all that's going to happen, actually, we're going to make it worse. So you can see this line up here on the right-hand side. Let's put our distortion correction in, it starts to bend it. So that doesn't work, and the reason is because it's a generic distortion. If we actually have the right lens profile, so even if I go to the similar one, don't do this normally, but just for demonstration purposes, let's go to a similar one and I do distortion correction. You see it's not moving that much. And that's because Capture One knows that this particular lens doesn't have much distortion, so it doesn't need to do much. The generic one, just be careful. That distortion correction is going to be massive because it's catering for every lens from ultra wide to extreme zoom. So chromatic aberration on. We use the profile that we just did. Don't worry about distortion correction. No issue with sharpness here. Our information is pretty sharp there. That's key down here. That's our subject. So what we can do on here, though, at ISO 12,800, thanks David, is we can do a little bit of noise correction. Just one question here. So 805 at Nora. Interesting name. Okay, what is the clarity slider doing under the hood? Local contrast enhancer. Yes, so if you go on our YouTube channel, you'll find there is something called a pro tips video on clarity. So it's about clarity, structure, and sharpening. It goes into this in infinite amounts of detail. Effectively, though, what clarity is doing is it's looking for areas where the border between two areas has a difference between light and dark. It takes the lighter area and it makes it lighter still, and it makes the darker area darker still. So it's a relative contrast adjustment. So if something is mid-gray and something is slightly lighter gray, what clarity is going to do, depending on how much you push it, it's going to make the lighter gray lighter still and the mid-gray darker still. If it was next to a darker gray, it would make the darker area darker and the mid-gray lighter, and so on. What that means is you could end up with some byproducts that you don't want, but if you do it well and you do it within reason, you can end up with some really nice contrasty poppy images that really, really stand out. I'm going to use a bit of clarity on here. Okay, so the noise correction that we've got in Capture One, if I'm honest, there are heavier noise reduction tools out there. So if you've got a really, really, really heavy noise image, there are tools out there that profess to do it better. In my experience, they can also introduce some bad things into your image as well, some artifacts you don't want. In this case, let's go without any noise reduction. So Capture One automatically defaults to 50 in here for a generic image. With none, we can see all of this noise in there. Dialed into 50, it's done a pretty good job, actually. I'm actually quite impressed with what it's done. But here is where we have a challenge. Everything you do with noise reduction is effectively introducing blur. So what happens then is we end up with this seesaw effect. We do a bit of noise reduction, it becomes blurry. So we do a bit of sharpening and then it gets noisier. A bit more noise reduction becomes blurry, a bit more sharpening becomes becomes noisier. Don't get into that trap. You need to decide, and not in a high ISO image, how much noise is appropriate and acceptable to you and how much is not. Bearing in mind the trade-off for fixing that noise is you are going to lose some detail. Don't end up in this seesaw between these two tools. They're counteracting each other. So let's go into our noise reduction and just load it up a little bit higher. And what I can do with sharpening is I can target some of these edges rather than the areas. So let's pull our threshold down, which says to Capture One, right, basically, how much difference in contrast does it have to see before it considers sharpening something? So my threshold lower. My radius determine, in fact, let me show you. So let's put our sharpening all the way up. See these horrible halos around the outside and the extra noise that you're seeing? That's a byproduct of over sharpening. The radius determines how far away from an edge Capture One is allowed to go in order to give you the appearance of sharpness. Just so we're all talking the same language, there is no such thing as a sharpening tool. The best sharpening tool you've got in your camera is called its autofocus. If you get the focus right, then it'll be sharp. If someone is moving too fast, like in this case, or you're using a high ISO because it's low light, or a million different reasons, you will end up with a less than sharp image. A sharpening tool is not going to fix things that were never sharp in the first place. It cannot. And all of this stuff that turns around and talks about AI and intelligent sharpening tools and whatever, from my perspective, is lying to you, because it can interpret what is happening in that scene, and it can create things in there that give the impression of something being sharp, but it is not able to see detail that was never there in the first place. So to Serge or Sergey, I can't remember which way we say your name, non-photographers don't mind noise as much as they mind unsharpness. Yeah, absolutely. So you have to determine where your threshold is for noise and where your threshold is for sharpness. If an image is out of focus or unsharp, people are going to notice that more, especially when it comes to things like press images. So yes, we want sharpening. Yes, we want a little bit of it, but keep it under control. That radius allowing the sharpening tool to get out of control. Over here, you get all these halos and weird things and whatever that look horrible. So do not over sharpen. The other thing with sharpening, do not use your sharpening tool at this level of zoom or even this level of zoom. Use it at this, because what looks fine out here and nice and sharp now, when I get into 100 or 200%, it looks horrible. And when I go to print something, it's 100% that I'm seeing. So pull this back. We pull our sharpening amount down, we pull our radius down, which controls how far capture, sorry, that was a bit of a rant, wasn't it? Anyway, controls how far capture one can stray from the edges and apply a little bit of sharpening on it. If I just do before and after now, there's our before, there's our after. It is very, very, very subtle because the change I've made is really small. I can put a bit more sharpening on there, but I'm going to pull that radius back again. And I'm also going to turn up some halo suppression. Okay, so here, no, here, not too much difference. We've got rid of some of the noise. We've got a little bit of extra sharpening, but I don't want to push it too much. That's all it comes down to. Don't push it too much. Now on the crop that David did for this, I think it was quite a landscapey crop. My gut feel on this, I know we can't do some things, but I would rotate or keystone it. So from a lens correction point of view, rather than distortion, I'm just going to pull our image to be correct and vertical. So let's just do that and that. The reason I'm doing it with keystoning is because I think some of this is also a bit of perspective distortion in terms of the angle. So if I just do rotate, it's literally going to rotate the image. If I do it from keystone, we can see that it's made a couple of changes where it's a little bit different down here to here, which is a different approach to the sharpening tool. So keystone allows us to flex effectively the image and fix some of that. Okay, so with that done, and I think the crop that you had, and I don't know whether it was because you wanted that crop or not, but it was a 2x3 crop, I think, or maybe a 4x3, but landscape. So let's go back to that crop that you had in there. And let's get into the action here. Now, do I need the background, this guy here? Not sure. My gut feel is probably to leave him out, and actually we just go right into there. Now we're talking. Okay, now I think that was pretty similar to where you were before. Here's a challenge for you guys. Normally when we're doing this stuff, if we see something unwanted, we just delete it, right? So if we saw this here, which is the edge of the other player, well, we'd just use a clone tool or a heal tool and we delete it. An editor is not going to accept that in terms of press photos, so we have to bring our crop in to get rid of it if we want it to be clean. Cropping is no problem, cloning and healing and so on is. So even with this bit down here, we've got a bit of an issue. We might have to just accept it. What I'd be tempted to do on this one is to up our contrast a little bit. So what I can't do is change colors, but what I can do is change potentially the intensity of things so we can increase our contrast. Now, remember, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The contrast tool is a very, very blunt tool, but what it can do is it can take the histogram, split it down the middle, anything brighter than the midpoint, make it brighter, anything darker, make it darker. So I can pull up my contrast a little bit more. That's going to give us darker areas over these guys and lighter areas on the ice. I can also use a bit of high dynamic range. I know we've done some stuff with press images before with high dynamic range. Effectively, high dynamic range is allowing you access to some of the dynamic range that your camera didn't produce in the original RAW. And in this case, what I'd be tempted to do is to pull up those shadows just a bit. Be careful. What we're seeing in here is hot pixels when it was zoomed out. That was the single pixel noise reduction tool in here, which is set at 50 in this case. It's probably a bit high. If I set it to 0, we're going to see some of those single pixels come back. If I set it up to probably about here, that's going to fix that. But in terms of the shadows, I kind of want to see a little bit more detail in those shadows. So not that much. I'm just going to pull it up maybe 6 or 7 in there. And then finally, and be careful with this, with a high ISO image, clarity can have a negative effect. But let's just pull that up a touch just to get a bit more of a pop. Okay. That's all I do with this one, David, honestly. The challenge you have is you've got limits on what you can do and edit. But to me, if I go to before and after, so there's our before. Here's our after. It's a bit more punchy, a bit brighter, a bit more contrasty, a bit sharper. We need to be careful that we haven't overdone any. So there's our sharpening effect down here, and clarity has played a part in that too. So we need to be careful we haven't overdone it too much. And again, go into 100% or more to check that out. Let's go even back to maybe even 14 or so. So here's our guy down here. Here's our before, a little bit flatter. Here's our after, a bit punchier. It's probably going to stand out a bit more on a page. We've got some really cool white ice. That's going to help a bit, but just remember, with press stuff, guys, you are very limited in the stuff that we would normally do. That's probably as far as I'd go. Okay, so weirdly, we've done basically 2 images today, which is probably the slowest rate that we've ever done images before in one of these sessions. I'm sorry about some of the hiccups at the start. We'll try and work that out for next time as to why that YouTube thing was going a bit weird. But if you want to talk about any of the stuff that is covered in this section or session or any of the other ones, then go onto that Facebook group. You can sign up. There's a couple of questions and then you'll get automatically added on. But genuinely post your images, post the stuff up there that you've got questions with, and we'll try and we'll collectively as a group, we'll try and get to the bottom of them. Remember, as I mentioned before, if there's things like clarity or the editing tools or brightness versus exposure and whatever, we've got those pro tips things. So remember as well, you can upload images using that tool. So if you want your stuff covered next week, even though we're probably going to struggle to get through some of the backlog at the moment, we'll get them into the list at least, and we'll try and get them edited as soon as we can. But send them on that upload tool. Remember to include your name, otherwise we don't know who you are and we don't know whose image it is, and we'll try and play with as many as we can next week. But in the meantime, send us messages and all the other stuff that you want on those channels. We started putting some funky stuff up on Instagram with all the behind the scenes stuff, which we don't normally do, so have a little look at that, because we've got some weird stories in there too. But failing that, hopefully stay well, stay safe, and all the other normal stuff that everyone now says. And we'll catch you next Thursday at the same time, and hopefully on the right channel. Cool. Catch you later, guys. Bye.